It's often quipped that most authors do research in order to write a book, but J.R.R. Tolkien was different. He had done the research, and now he needed a book in which to set it. From 1925 to 1945, Tolkien was the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon at the University of Oxford, though his interest with early Germanic literature was already well entrenched before this time. The Horse Lords of Rohan, with their martial culture and language based on the Mercian dialect of Old English, are perhaps the people of Middle-earth most clearly inspired by the Anglo-Saxons. Their king, Theoden, is no exception, drawing on numerous fonts of inspiration. One of them is almost certainly a legendary battle that took place in a Frisian fort at some point in the murky migration period, which Tolkien was intimately familiar with. In The Lord of the Rings, Theoden embodies both the honour and the burden of kingship. At first, he is poisoned and bewitched by agents of the evil wizard Saruman, physically and mentally decaying. As a result, his kingdom is overrun by both orcs and Dunlendings under the sway of Isengard. When the remnants of the Fellowship arrive at his great hall, the Meduseld, meaning literally the mead hall in Old English, the king's niece Eowyn stands alone, mourning the recent death in battle of her cousin, the king's son Theodred, and the estrangement of her brother Eomer. Theoden initially rebuffs the Fellowship, until the wizard Gandalf reveals his chief advisor, Grima Wormtongue, to be an agent of Saruman. To stir him from inaction, the heroes have Theoden draw his sword, Herugrim. With the instigation of the sword, Theoden comes to his senses, keening mentally and physically, and takes up the task of doing right by his people and leading them in war. He learns of the death of his son, and must mourn his death while making difficult choices for the good of his kingdom, even choosing to forego vengeance on his erstwhile tormentor, Grima Wormtongue. His first name is also derived of an old Germanic word, referring to a mask, which is fitting as he pretended for so long to be the king's friend and ally, while poisoning him behind his back. Taking the reins of Rohan once more, Theoden leads his people in the stout defence of Helm's Deep, and then on to the Pelennor Fields, where he meets his death leading a victorious charge to relieve the beleaguered Minas Tirith, leaving his nephew to become king of the Rohirrim, while Eowyn marries Faramir, cementing an alliance between Rohan and Gondor for a new age. Growing up as a Roman Catholic, Tolkien's mother was keen for her son to learn Latin, though he soon devoted his time to learning Old English, the language of the Anglo-Saxons. When he began studying at Oxford in 1913, he decided to switch classics for English language and literature, where he was taught, among others, by Joseph Wright, a specialist in Old and Middle English and German and in Gothic. Perhaps it was at this time, but almost certainly earlier, that Tolkien first encountered the Old English poem Beowulf. Starting in 1920 and finishing some 6 years later, Tolkien would go on to translate the entire poem into modern English prose, as well as a large part written in verse. However, a year earlier, Tolkien had become Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon, and while his manuscript lay in his drawer, he doodled on an empty page in between marking essays, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, and the rest is history." Tolkien was too busy and perhaps too perfectionistic to publish his Beowulf, although it was published posthumously in 2014. Tolkien's interest in the poem went far beyond that of just a translator, though. Almost all the elements of Theoden's story, particularly that taking place in the Meduseld, can be found in an episode remembered in Germanic poetry, and likely based on true events which happened somewhere in the mists of the migration period. It survives most clearly in Beowulf, as a tale told by the Shop or the Bard when Beowulf is feasting in the great hall of Heorot, although a fragment of it was also found on a scrap of vellum in Lambeth Palace in 1705. The drama takes place at a Meduseld-like building called Finnsburg, the home of King Finn Folkwalding, king of the Frisians. In both the Beowulf Finnsburg episode and in the Finnsburg fragment found at Lambeth Palace, the story starts in the middle of the action. The gun smoke is still hanging in the air, so to speak, and the bodies have only just been cleared. The scene opens with Hilbert, the daughter of the Danish king, who has married King Finn, mourning the death not only of their son, but also of her brother, the Danish prince Hnaf, who died before the narrative begins in a battle at Finnsburg between the Frisians and the Danes. What caused this fight is never specified, although it's likely Anglo-Saxon audiences knew the story well, since this is only alluded to in the poem. With many of his thanes killed in the battle, King Finn must make peace with the now leaderless Danes, who look to a warrior called Hengist to lead them in the negotiations. As part of the agreement, the Danes will stay the winter at Finnsburg, with Finn giving them gold, lodgings and food to keep the peace. Brooding until spring, it's only when the son of Hunlaf, one of the retainers, showed him the sword Hildehleoman that Hengist is stirred to action that honour demands, and he and the other Danes assail Finn, killing him and burning his hall to the ground, and then take Hildeburh back with them to Denmark. As an avid Germanic philologist, collector of folklore and translator of Beowulf, it won't surprise you that Tolkien also took a keen interest in the Finnsburg fight. Between 1928 and 1937, he gave 6 lecture courses on the subject of Finn and Hengist, with other Beowulf episodes and themes being addressed almost every year of his 2-decade tenure. Again and again in 1930, then in 1940, and finally in 1960, Tolkien had intense periods of research, lecturing and publication on the fight at Finnsburg. So much so that he would go on to produce several essays outlining his thinking that were posthumously compiled into another book entitled Finn and Hengist, the Fragment and the Episode, released in 1982. While Tolkien technically did not write the book on the subject, it was compiled and edited by Professor Alan Bliss from his writings. Many of the ideas he originally espoused are now taken as the mainstream academic interpretation. As with much of Tolkien's work, few things apart from names lifted from Old Norse poems and Old English dictionaries are directly incorporated into Middle-earth, rather being blended together and serving often as thematic inspiration. Theoden isn't precisely King Finn dropped into Middle-earth, but it's fair to say that the strands of the Finnsburg fight have been woven into the tapestry of the Two Towers. Hardly surprising that a piece of Germanic lore he spent so long thinking, lecturing and writing about would have such an impact in his literary works. Both Theoden and Finn are described as being aged rulers. That the king of Rohan's name, meaning prince or literally leader of the people, is found in the genitive case near the beginning of the Finnsburg episode in Beowulf might provide a clue to some of Tolkien's inspiration. Finn is also known as Finn Folkwalding, which is either the name of his father, Folkwald, or perhaps more likely a title. In all Germanic languages, titles often came after personal names, so Finn Folkwalding and Theoden King, that's why they say it the other way round in The Lord of the Rings. Folkwalding in turn means ruler of the people, so almost identical in meaning to Theoden. Both the opening of the Finnsburg episode in Beowulf and the arrival of the fellowship at Edoras are marked by a past conflict in which the king's son has died. Both feature centrally a single mourning woman, Hildeburh in the poem, mourning the death of her son and brother, and Eowyn in The Lord of the Rings, mourning the death of her cousin and the imprisonment of her brother. While not found in the Finnsburg episode, Tolkien certainly had Beowulf in mind when describing the hall, Meduseld. In fact, he has Legolas speak a translation of a line directly taken from the poem describing the hall Heorot. Lichte se leoma over landa fela. The light of it shines far over the land. The entire entrance of the fellowship into the Meduseld follows exactly the procedure for approaching a king as it's laid out in Beowulf. First, the hero is stopped by a coast guard, then by a guard at the gate where they have to pile up their arms. In The Lord of the Rings, the fellowship are stopped first at the gates outside Edoras and then at the door to the Meduseld, where one of the retainers of the king insists on taking their weapons. Gandalf memorably asks,
"Who would not part an old man from his walking stick?"
and then goes on to use it in the struggle in the hall. In Beowulf, it's his bare hands that are capable of doing the damage, though in both examples the unassuming weapon is still smuggled past the guards. The presence of another weapon is central both to Theoden's restoration to health in The Lord of the Rings and to spurring the leader of the Danes to action in the Finnsburg episode. In the film, this is a cool scene, with Theoden remembering his former strength by wielding his sword and reclaiming his position as king of a proud, martial people. As inspiring as it is, this scene doesn't convey the deep significance the bearing of the sword had for the Germanic audiences of Beowulf. The particular sword being given to Hengist in the Finnsburg episode is important. The sword may have been named Hildeleoma, and the poem tells us that Thasweiron mit Eotenum edge kuthe. Its edges were renowned among the Jutes. Hildeleoma also sounds like a kenning, a compact metaphor often used in the Germanic languages. Here it means battle light, which refers to a sword. In fact, my name Hilbert has the same first element meaning battle, while Bert or Bert means bright. So my name is also an old kenning for a sword, meaning battle bright. As Tolkien summarizes in Finn and Hengist, the placing of Hildeleoma on Hengist's lap was evidently fraught with deep significance, for quite apart from the fact that its edges were renowned among the Jutes, the whole run of the passage shows clearly that it finally decided him to give effect to his thoughts of revenge. As well as spurring him to violence, the offering of the sword also symbolizes the conveying of leadership over the survivors to Hengist as the successor to the killed Danish prince Hnaf. In the Germanic world of Beowulf and in later Norse sources, swords were sworn on to show fealty to a lord. In a somewhat similar way, after Gandalf, Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli enter the Meduseld, they become Theoden's men, eating and drinking in his hall and then fighting for him at the Battle of Helm's Deep. In the Fellowship of the Ring at the Council of Elrond, there is a much more explicit swearing fealty on weapons.
You have my sword. And you have my bow.
And my axe.
Theoden's sword also has a name, Herugrim, which is another kenning lifted directly from Beowulf following the eponymous hero's fight with Grendel's mother. Just as in Beowulf, in the Two Towers, it's Theoden's retainer Hammer who finds the sword locked away and rusting and kneels to present it to his king. As for Hengist, the drawn sword for Theoden marks a transition between inactivity and brooding to active leadership and battle against enemies towards whom he had previously turned a blind eye. One of the ways Middle-earth feels so rich, real and lived in is the layering effect, whereby characters and places ooze a sense of deep time and long past. Just as the sword in Beowulf tells the story of previous deeds, so Tolkien seeds deep roots in Middle-earth by drawing on an imagined past. There are many more influences on Theoden as a person and the Rohirrim as a race. The Finnsburg fight in Beowulf is a small part in a grand tapestry of inspiration woven together by the great author. Many have drawn parallels between Theoden and Theodoric, king of the Goths, who was slain in battle fighting alongside the Western Roman Empire and crushed by his horse. Tolkien skillfully blended the Anglo-Saxon love of horses and horsemanship found more readily in their poetry than in their military stratagems with several more cavalry cultures of the migration era. Tom Shippey certainly sees the influence in Road to Middle-earth. Maybe the infantry fixation of historical periods was the result of living on an island. Maybe the Anglo-Saxons before they migrated to England were different. What would have happened had they turned east, not west, to the German plains and the steppes beyond? In creating the Riddermark, Tolkien thought of his own Mercia. He also certainly remembered the great lost romance of Gothia, of the close kin of the English turning to disaster and oblivion on the plains of Russia. This is another thematic connection with the Finnsburg fight. as with Hengist and the inclusion of the Jutes and the Danes, it's often thought that this took place around the same time that the Anglo-Saxons moved into England. Whatever conscious or subconscious influence from Finnsburg, Edoras is not burnt to the ground, and the kin strife between Theoden and Eomer is resolved. Eowyn is not carried off to the backdrop of a burning hall, as is Hildeburh in Beowulf, but instead she marries Faramir, one of the foremost men in Gondor, cementing an alliance between their two peoples much more successfully than Hildeburh, who is implied to have been a peace weaver, coming from Denmark to marry a Frisian king, but ending all in tragedy and strife when the two fight each other anyway. In other words, the Finnsburg fight finds a happy ending in Rohan. I hope this has been interesting for everyone, and I'd be happy to make some videos on the Lord of the Rings in Frisian and the translation, and also a dedicated video on the Finnsburg fight and the Frisians in the migration period. Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, until then, ik ben Hilbert en dit wie het Friesk. Ontjen.